Welcome to the Asset Reliability at Work podcast.
Endless journey of delight and profitability.
I think some people use it as a derogatory term towards accountants.
Being visible to the employees is important.
Hey, what's going on, podcast listeners, and welcome back to another episode on the Asset Reliability at Work podcast. Today, we're welcoming in Doug Wallace, who is a senior materials management subject matter expert with over 35 years of combined experience as both a manager and management consultant. More recently, Doug has spent the better part of the past 15 years providing reliability-based MRO materials management services to nearly 40 different organizations that span across various industries. So Doug joins the podcast today to highlight the purpose of a manufacturing storeroom and how to set one up that improves maintenance performance and increases production levels for the entire organization. Now let's get the conversation started with Doug Wallace in this episode titled, Make Your Maintenance Storeroom Great Again. So now as we get into this episode, and by we, I mean myself and, of course, our lovely co-host, Tara Hallwegner, who you'll hear throughout this episode, I want to get right into it and ask you the basic question of what is the purpose of a manufacturing storeroom?
Well, what it should be is to house materials in a safe, clean, secure, and preferably organized environment. But the storeroom itself is just a part of a overall materials management organization with a mission to make sure that maintenance and operations have all the parts that they need when they need them at the right quality and the lowest possible total cost of the organization. And note that I said have what they need when they need them, not what they want when they want them. But unfortunately, what we see a lot is that the storeroom, if one even exists, is really just, it becomes a dumping ground for excess and obsolete parts, project materials that were never used, things that were taken out of service or scavenged for parts and they're no longer usable, or even stuff like files, Christmas decorations, you name it, just about anything that people don't know what to do with, that really have absolutely no purpose for maintenance and operations, and it makes it hard for a materials management organization to fulfill that mission.
Just so I lay it out here, and you've got obviously many years of experience in this subject. So do you most often find that when you go into and provide consulting services when it comes to storeroom that people already have storerooms and they just need it to be cleaned up and fixed? Or you see most people need a new design or need a storeroom? Well,
we see a little bit of both. I mean, more often than not, people already have some kind of a storeroom set up. It's infrequent that we would go in and find people that just have parts scattered all over the place, but that's not uncommon.
Okay.
And obviously, being a consultant, what we don't see a lot of is people that already have a world-class setup, best practices in place. If that were the case, they wouldn't need consulting help. But I would say probably 75 to 80% of our projects deal with people that already have a storeroom and either just need to make improvements to that storeroom or they want to move that to another building. The other, 15, 20, 25% are people that need to consolidate their stuff into a storeroom just to get that operation going.
Thanks for that foundational understanding of the purpose of a storeroom, Doug. One thing that Derek and I were talking about before this recording was the advancement of smart technology. We have smart cars and smart homes and, of course, the ubiquitous smartphone. But he and I were wondering, how could this advancement in technology and the smart technology be affecting storerooms in manufacturing organizations? Are storerooms becoming smarter?
Well, to that I'd say both yes and no. I mean, we're starting to see more companies that are interested in using technology in their storerooms, talking about things like vending machines, barcoding, scanners, RFID, handhelds, that kind of stuff. The concern we have with technology is that a lot of times people see the technology as the solution to their problem, when their problem really has nothing to do with technology. It's more about policy, procedure, processes. I mean, we always tell people that technology is just a tool to make your basic practices more effective and more efficient. And you have to have those basics in place for that technology to provide the maximum benefit. Now, clearly, when it comes to materials management, technology is outpacing most of our customers. So the things I just described, they're not exactly cutting edge. I mean, barcoding's been around for decades, but very few of our customers have effectively incorporated that into their operation. So for some reason, it just seems like the rate of adoption is slower in the materials world. And I don't know if that's because the technology is seen as being too expensive, too difficult to implement, or maybe just too scary to contemplate for some people. But none of those is really true. A lot of times, all it takes is somebody with the initiative to get the ball rolling, try some stuff out, find out what works, and then it's pretty easy to roll that technology out. Excuse me.
Yeah.
But when you think about the stuff that you described, what's coming, those things I described, that's just what's available now. If you think about opportunities that are coming, materials can be duplicated through 3D printing. Drones are starting to deliver packages. Grocery stores are going cashierless with either self-checkout or readers that can check you out as you take the items off the shelf or just roll your cart out of the store. Heck, there's refrigerators now that do a better job of keeping track of what's inside than a lot of organizations do of knowing what's in their storerooms.
Yeah.
We've even seen one retail customer that was trying to use RFID to complete a full physical inventory of their entire store in less than 15 minutes.
Wow.
Which was important for them because they had to do it twice a month. So these are all capabilities that have applications in the materials management world. But for a lot of the people that we're dealing with, they're really so far down the road that they're not even ready to start thinking about that stuff. And again, like I said, to have the basics in place, we're dealing with a lot of clients that just have to put in basic work practices and processes. If they get to the point where they're thinking about technology, usually they're thinking about scanners, barcoding, maybe vending machines, and in some cases handhelds as kind of the first step.
So it's really important to get the basics right and then try to optimize. Let's talk about that a little more. How should a facility go about planning and setting up a storeroom to enable them to be more efficient as a company?
Well, there's an awful lot to consider here. In fact, I've done separate webinars and and papers just on that very subject. But basically, obviously, it all starts with the physical building. So you have to have enough space for the materials that you should be keeping in there. Again, not what everybody wants to give you, but the stuff that you should be keeping. And you have to allow for some room for expansion. Target utilization is usually about 80%. Particularly in a growing operation, so you don't set up a storeroom or build a new building and then immediately run out of space. And again, the obvious things you need, sound structure, good lighting, has to have all the facilities, preferably some good environmental controls so that we take care of things that can be affected by temperature, humidity, dust, dirt, that kind of stuff. Location of the building is a consideration, but that depends on a bunch of factors. But then we start to look at security, or maybe a better way to say it is controls to limit access, make sure that parts don't get up and walk away. And then we start to look inside that building at things like the layout. Do we have things organized for optimal flow? Are we making the best utilization of our available floor space and vertical space? We're using the right kind of storage medium. By that I mean, pallet racks, shelves, high-density cabinets, carousels, whatever it is that's going to be appropriate for the types of materials that we're storing. And then we also look at things like the CMMS or the inventory control system. Is that set up to help people identify and locate the parts they need so they can get in, get what they want, and get out? Do we have signs and other visual management tools to help people find their way around once they get inside the storeroom? And then we look at other things like, do we have all the effective processes in place to identify what you need, to buy it, to stock it, to manage it while it's in the storeroom, issue it out, take care of it while it's on the shelf. And then there's some other corollary things like we look at making sure that people have the right handling equipment, fork trucks, pallet jacks, ladders, whatever. And we even look at things like staffing levels, effectiveness of the training of those people. And then we kind of bundle it all together by looking to see whether people have the right kind of metrics in place to tell you whether you're running a competitive operation or not. So these are things that all need to be in place to even be close to being considered as a best practice operation, let alone world class.
Yeah, that makes sense. So what about the facility that already has a storeroom, but it's a mess? It's not serving its purpose, basically. What can they do to transform that storeroom?
Yeah, we do run into this, and I can tell you it's not an easy undertaking. In a lot of cases, it can be harder to repurpose an existing storeroom than to just start from scratch. So, first of all, what you have to have is you have to have a vision of where you want that storeroom to be, what you want it to look like, how you want it to operate, because you don't really want to do this stuff more than once. And the other thing that's going to be important is once you decide where you want to be, there's a lot of people that can help you put together the project plan to get there, but you have to have the right resources, you have to have a good project plan, and you have to have the dedication to follow that. So, to redo an existing facility, a lot of times it means emptying out all or part of that storeroom, which might mean you have to have some temporary storage space. You might have to make a bunch of updates to your inventory system. In a lot of cases, it could mean making repairs or upgrades to the existing building, which would be maybe you got to put sprinklers in, improve the airflow to reduce dust and dirt, put environmental controls in there, add or replace lighting, repair the roofs and windows. Usually you have to paint the walls and floors. And a lot of times it requires replacing old rack shelves, with newer stuff, or even buying newer materials, high density cabinets, carousels, that kind of stuff that also have to be properly installed. Sometimes the customer can do that. Sometimes we have to have contractors do that. But it all takes time, and obviously it takes people. It takes good project management skills, like I said, and unfortunately, but the reality is it does take money in a lot of cases, and in some cases it's not very cheap. But I would say most important, what it takes is support from leadership to make that decision to improve the operation. So, without that support, it's going to take a lot longer. If it gets done at all, it's going to be a lot harder. Your effort's probably going to run out of steam. But I can tell you, once you get through it and start to see what you can do, I mean, obviously, just from an appearance standpoint, the results of what we call a storeroom makeover, that can be pretty stunning just looking at before and after pictures. But what it also does is it really can improve the efficiency of the operation. And in a lot of cases, what it does, it just instills a tremendous amount of pride in the people that made that transformation to make sure that they don't slide back to where they used to be. They keep improving that operation and keep getting closer to world class.
So, what I'm curious about, and hopefully I think our listeners would be, is, so let's talk about, you have a storeroom set up, and it's almost world class. I mean, everything's best practice right now. What do you see? Like, what are the challenges of maintaining that storeroom? Like, what does it take for a storeroom to go from up top tier level all the way down to a mess? Like, what is that? What are people doing, do you think, that creates that environment?
Well, in most cases, the customers that don't have a good operation in place, it's just because they never got one started. And I mean, I've been in buildings, storerooms, I'll call them, but really they were just buildings, 100-year-old buildings that were basically left to go fallow. But somebody saw the opportunity for the space. They decided to turn that building into a storeroom. So in a lot of cases, it's just a legacy. They didn't have a good facility to start with, didn't have a good operation to start with, didn't have the leadership or the drive or the initiative to decide on their own to make it better. And again, the sad part is that a lot of times storerooms is kind of seen as a service organization, not really a contributor to the organization. And so a lot of times they do not get the funding that they need. Even if they want to make those improvements, they won't get the capital money or the expense money they need to make those kind of major improvements and get that operation up and going.
So, Doug, you've seen a lot in your years as a subject matter expert, and we wanted to know, what are some of the biggest challenges that you've seen on site that prevent maintenance departments from being more efficient?
Well, there's a lot. If I stay strictly with the materials management side of it,
sure.
I mean, obviously there's the maintenance side and operations side and planning and scheduling and all that kind of stuff. But strictly from the materials management perspective, it's pretty simple. It's either not having the right parts at the right time, or a lot of times it's maintenance people spending too much time searching for parts, waiting at the window, or just walking back and forth to the storeroom. These are all they're all time wasters. They all keep maintenance people from doing the stuff that they're supposed to do, which is doing PMs and repairing equipment and keeping it in good operating condition. But it's not all on maintenance. I don't want it to sound like it's really the maintenance people. I mean, there could be a lot of reasons for this. And there could be things like, hey, maybe you just don't have the right processes in place for deciding what parts to stock and when to order them and how much to order. You might not have the right information in your CMMS to make it easy to find the parts and find the ones you need and find out where they are and go get them. Again, there could be some issues with planning and scheduling that does impact the materials world. I mean, the more planning and scheduling you can do, the more lead time the storeroom guys have to determine what your material needs are, get that stuff ready, kit it or deliver it out to the field, or at least have it ready for the guys to come and pick up when it's time to do the job, so they're not running into delays waiting for those parts to be ready. And in some cases, it is just a matter of accountability of the maintenance people themselves or their frontline supervision, just to make sure that they aren't spending time chasing parts if they're supposed to be doing maintenance work.
So, Doug, it sounds like we're returning to some of your earlier points about making sure that you have your foundation and your standard processes and accountability in place to be able to be more efficient. One thing that, as we progress in this podcast, we wanted to introduce right now is something that Derek's been spearheading. We have been reaching out on Twitter to see if any of our listeners have questions that they'd like our asset reliability at work subject matter experts to answer. And he got a couple good ones, really good ones for this podcast. So we want to ask one now. The first question is from Jason. How have you seen customers justify automation or technology in MRO storerooms? For example, barcode scanning, which you talked a little bit about earlier.
We'll talk about technology in general, and then I'll talk a little bit more specifically about barcoding. And this can be a tough one because a lot of people run into that same situation. I mean, obviously, the biggest benefit of most storeroom technology is productivity, right? It's the ability you can do the same things faster, or you can get more done with the same resources. In some cases, it's just as simple as knowing or at least believing that technology is going to provide that productivity improvement. That could be enough to approve some technology, or at least get somebody started looking at the options and trying stuff out to find out how it's actually going to work for you. The challenge becomes a lot more difficult if you actually need to quantify that expected benefit up front to justify moving ahead with the technology. So in that case, what you'd have to do, I mean, in general terms, what you really have to do is identify the specific tasks that are going to be done using that technology, and then kind of estimate the time that'll be saved by using that technology versus whatever you're doing currently. So as an example, you think try and calculate how many minutes would be saved by allowing maintenance and operations people to go get their own PPE from a vending machine rather than filling out a requisition and getting it from the storeroom. How many hours could you save by putting RFID tags on special tools so that you can find them from your desk rather than wandering around the site until you happen to trip over one? How many trips back and forth to the office or the workstation in the storeroom can be avoided by using a handheld device? Even things like, how many more inventory counts or cycle counts can you do using a scanner rather than paper count sheets? I mean, so those are just some examples, but it's really what I'm talking about is you have to figure out, what do I want to use that technology for, and how much faster, better is it going to make my operation? Then once you know the kind of the productivity improvements, you can equate that to people, to dollars. You can kind of put some numbers around it. You can at least look at, well, this is the benefit in terms of financials, and when I look at the cost, is it worthwhile making that move ahead? I don't know that there's any official benchmarks on productivity improvement through storm technology, but if I just had to pick a number, I'd say it wouldn't surprise me if it's at least 10% or more, and it's probably on the higher end of that. To get back to barcoding, look at barcoding and scanning in particular. the one thing you also have there is the added benefit of improved data accuracy. So, there are people that say even the best data entry person or typer or whatever is going to make a mistake every 300 keystrokes or so. So, barcoding most often, what we see it is used for things like cycle counts, for putaways, for issuing parts. We've seen, people work with their suppliers to even try and reduce the amount of data entry required during their incoming receiving process. But even if you only use scanners for one purpose, just to eliminate typing in part numbers for all those transactions, you think about some places will have maybe a 6-digit part number, some will have 12. You look at how many keystrokes that is, and if it's correct that you're going to do an error once every 300 keystrokes, it's pretty easy to estimate the number of errors that are going to happen that can be avoided or reduced through the use of the technology. And it's in addition to the number of mistakes, it's also going to matter what the impact of those errors is. Particularly if they affect your inventory accuracy on a critical spare, for example, or a part that's needed right away. I think I have that part, but I don't because I keystroked some information wrong and I messed up my inventory. The impact of that could be significant in terms of lost production and productivity. One last thing I'll say is, if after all that you still don't have enough to justify the technology, one thing we recommend to people is, hey, we'll let you talk to somebody who's done it. That's probably one of the best places to get some helpful information. Now, what somebody else did isn't necessarily going to happen in your case, but at least subjectively, you can get some input from those folks on, hey, if how well received were your handhelds or your scanners? How did people like this stuff? What are you using? What kind of benefits did you get out of it?
That's an excellent answer. And so for our last Twitter question, this comes from Joe. He said, how many storeroom or warehouse workers prefer mobile devices for processing versus desktop computers at stations?
Well, my silly answer would be almost everybody who gets one and learns how to use it. But there's really two ways to look at it. It doesn't happen by itself. This is going to might not sound right, but it's true. The younger generation, more comfortable with technology, more likely to be eager to use technology and go ask for it as a productivity improvement or just something that they see as a regular way of doing business rather than using a terminal or paper or whatever. Unfortunately, what we see in a lot of cases is that the folks that are working in the storerooms are longer service people who are maybe a little bit more reluctant to adopt the technology, and so they need a little bit more of a push to try it out and see how it works. But so those are the kind of folks that are less likely to ask for it, maybe because they don't, because they're kind of scared of it or they don't even know about it. But in most cases, once we introduce that technology to them, whether that be a scanner or a handheld or something like that, they usually adopt it very quickly, and wonder why they didn't do it sooner. The only case I can say where we found people where that was not the case was they got a gun scanner with a single trigger, and the guys were kind of complaining that after going around and shooting this gun couple hundred times a day, it was starting to give them problems with the carpal tunnel syndrome. So that had nothing to do with their resistance to the technology. They just had to find a better tool that wasn't going to cause them those kinds of problems. Once they got a different system in there, it worked fine. So I guess to sum it up, what I would say is whatever the technology is, if it's easy to use, people are going to try it. And once they try it, they're probably going to like it, and they'll continue to use it.
Thanks so much for joining us, Doug. In addition to the listener questions that we were able to answer on air, I'm sure you answered some other questions that listeners have had about how to make their storeroom more efficient and effective.
Doug, thank you so much. You absolutely nailed this podcast. You gave such great answers that were very in-depth with a lot of detail, and we can't thank you enough. But really quick to our listeners, as I do normally at the end of our shows, at the end of our episodes, I do want to direct you back to our show notes. You can find a couple links in our show notes, and two of them in particular are articles that Doug wrote regarding materials management topics. So the first one is titled, "Is Your MRO Storeroom a Productivity Trap?" And the second is, does your storeroom layout make sense? And the third link we have available was written by another consultant of ours. It's titled Extreme Makeover Storeroom Edition. And then finally, we'll have a link to connect with Doug on LinkedIn. So with that being said, Doug, thank you so much for coming on and joining us on the podcast today.
My pleasure. Enjoyed it, Derek. Thanks.
And so, listeners, that's where we end today's episode. We look forward to seeing you in 2 more weeks on the Asset Reliability at Work podcast. Hey, listeners, one more thing before you go. If you have any feedback for the show, or you have maybe some suggestions for upcoming topics you'd love to hear about, we'd like to hear from you. So there's 2 ways to get in contact with us. The first is on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @LCE_today, so be sure to follow us. And then the other way is to email the show at podcast@lce.com. Once again, thank you for joining the show, and we look forward to more episodes on the Asset Reliability at Work podcast.